trouble with the video or the audio, jump in and tell me, or Ari, you can always chat or text me if we need to adjust.
Well, this is probably, from my perspective, the best audio and visual we've had with you from Sharon by doing the phone. So
Poo. Hopefully it'll stay that way. When you're trying to do anything really important, there are always obstacles. So this session must be really important because we're facing tech obstacles we haven't faced before. So this is the last in a series on tales of conflict. We've traveled through biblical times and rabbinic times. And indeed, this time I want to see something from the Hasidic world that I've mentioned before. I've alluded to this a couple of times, and I wasn't planning on doing this, but it came up and felt very natural to dive into this material. My experience of this material that we're going to explore today began when I was in yeshiva in Israel. I was in an Orthodox yeshiva that had a very strong emphasis on Hasidism. And this yeshiva was also very open-minded. And it was a very interesting combination of depth of Hasidic practice and openness to the world around us. And the yeshiva invited a speaker. An Orthodox yeshiva invited a speaker who's a well-known, non-Orthodox Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory, the founder of the Jewish Renewal movement, who's also deeply immersed in and it was inspired by Hasidic life, but brought it to all kinds of creative expressions outside of the Orthodox community. And Reb Zalman, as he was called affectionately by his students and friends, came to the yeshiva. And he gave a wonderful talk about Hasidism, about Kabbalah, and about imagination, the power of imagination in learning. For him, it was kind of a homecoming to the Orthodox community because usually he wasn't in an Orthodox environment. And he really enjoyed, you could tell, and he said to people later that he really enjoyed being with Orthodox students who were interested in Hasidism. But it was a sort of strange pairing. And a few days after he visited, the yeshiva started getting threatening phone calls from people in an ultra-Orthodox community somewhere else in Israel. It wasn't a local thing. It was another community pretty far away in Israel, relatively speaking, calling and saying, how could you have that person speak at your yeshiva? We're going to close you down. And these phone calls were happening, on the hour, every hour for a couple of days. And people were responding to it and talking about it. And there's a lot of murmuring about, what does this mean? And does it mean anything? And the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Natan Greenberg, who is a Breslaver Chassid and the nephew of Rabbi Yitzhak Blue Greenberg, stood up and said at the weekly talk that he gave to the yeshiva, he stood up and talked about this situation. And he said, I know that a lot of you are concerned about these phone calls, and some of you want to respond to these threatening phone calls from some ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. They're upset that we had Reb Zalman here. You want to respond and maybe justify or fight back. But I want to tell you something. In the 1830s, the Breslaver Hasidim, the followers of Rabbi Nachman, this is now after Rabbi Nachman had passed away though, 1830s. Rabbi Nachman passed away in 1810. And the leader of the community, not the Rebbe, but the leader of the community, was Rabbi Nachman's student, Reb Nassan of Breslov. In that time, the Breslaver Hasidim faced tremendous persecution by another Hasidic group. So those of you who have been with us in the series on Hasidism know that what began with opposition from without later became opposition within the Hasidic community, splits, schisms, critique of one sect by another sect. No one had this as badly as the Breslaver Hasidim. In fact, one of the later Hasidic rabbis in Poland said there were two people in all of Jewish history who faced tremendous persecution, more persecution than anyone else in Jewish history from other Jews, from his co-religionists. And those two people were King David, who was persecuted by his own son, among others, and Reb Nassan of Breslov, the closest student of Rabbi Nachman. They were persecuted by a Hasidic group. Rav Natan Greenberg, who's telling us this, said, some of the younger Breslover Hasidim wanted to respond in kind to the persecution which took the form of refusal to sell any goods or services to Breslover Hasidim, a public ban against joining them in any business ventures or marrying off your children to their children, informing on them to the Russian authorities so that Breslover Hasidim would be arrested, and even physical violence. There were some of the younger Breslover Hasidim who wanted to respond in kind. And Rav Natan told us that Reb Nassan of Breslov refused and told his followers, the young, hot-headed Hasidim, the Breslover Hasidim, who were being persecuted, not to respond, but instead to transmute their energy, their anger, their reactivity into even more efforts to do what they were already doing, which was to engage in study and prayer and spiritual practice, and put all of your energy into that, said Reb Nassan. And you'll see that the machlokes, the controversy, will go away. And in fact, that's what happened. A few years later, the controversy melted away in a very strange and surprising way. Rav Natan Greenberg told us this in yeshiva, and that convinced all of the students in the yeshiva to relax and to not take anything that was happening so seriously, to not be so concerned about these phone calls from people in the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox community, that because we had Reb Zalman. So I sat there and listened to this, and I thought, that's really interesting. That reminds me of something. What does it remind me of? It reminds me of stories about Gandhi, who practiced nonviolent resistance, who dealt with a very different but sort of similar situation of oppression and trying to deal with the threat of power from a much more powerful adversary. In his case, it was the British Empire, and who refused to react with the same kind of tactics, the same kind of violence that the British Empire was using against first those minorities in South Africa and then in India, whom Gandhi was trying to help and trying to serve and trying to lead. And it also reminded me of Dr. Martin Luther King, who also used nonviolence, inspired in part by Gandhi in the civil rights movement in the South. And I thought, that's really interesting. It sounds like there's a hint of a pre-modern nonviolent movement in response to conflict and persecution. What does it look like to find a pre-modern Jewish spiritual nonviolent movement? I want to look into this. So this is my introduction to this story that we're going to look at today, the story of the persecution of the Breslover Hasidim, the conflict between the Breslovers and another Hasidic group called the Savraner Hasidim. Before we dive into it, though, I need to tell you that this story was suppressed to an extent by the Breslover Hasidim because they didn't want to be associated with conflict. And so I knew that there was a book written about these events in the 1830s in the Ukraine, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I couldn't find it in Israel. I couldn't find it in America. I looked and looked and looked. And finally, I went back to Rav Natan Greenberg, who told us this story in the first place. And I said, where do you find the record of these events? He said, there's a book, but it's not published. It was pulled from the shelves in the 70s. It's called Yemei Hatzlaos, The Days of the Troubles. It was printed in Jerusalem by a Breslover Chassid. And then it was pulled from the shelves, and you can't find it in an actual book form. But I'll tell you what, I'm coming to the States. I'll bring my copy. I have a manuscript, and I'll meet you, and we'll make a copy for you. So I met Rav Natan at midnight at a Kinko's in New York, on the Upper West Side, and it was like a secret deal. We met in the middle of the night. He snuck in the manuscript, and we sat there for about an hour, Xeroxing every page. And that was the copy I used to then learn about these events and to eventually write my doctoral dissertation about these events, because it really is a model of pre-modern, nonviolent conflict transformation, which is fascinating to me, because we need some of those tools and some of those methods today in dealing with conflict. So now, to the story itself. So Ari, can you share the screen? We're going to look at some texts from the Breslover Hasidim dealing with this moment and this series of events. And it begins with, this is actually a quote from a 20th century Breslover Chassid, the teacher of several of my teachers, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Bender. And he wrote, there were many moments when the Breslover Chassidim thought that our Rebbe's way, Inyan Rabbeinu, or the Rebben Zach in Yiddish, that the Rebbe's teachings, Rabbi Nachman's teachings about joy, about developing a personal, unscripted connection with the divine, personal prayer. There were many moments when they thought that the whole thing, the whole movement, the whole community of Breslover Hasidim was going to end, God forbid. This was the case, for example, during the great conflict in the time of Reb Nassan. That's the conflict we're talking about in the 1830s. But it also happened later in the time of Reb Nachman of Tulchin in the next generation, and also later when the communists took power and announced that anyone caught and identified as a Breslover Chassid would be sentenced to death, and also after World War II when the majority of Breslover Hasidim were destroyed, both in Russia under the communists and in Poland under the Nazis. And remember that many other Hasidic groups disappeared. We have Hasidic masters, several of whom we studied, who left no successors. One example is Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. We spent some time with him in one of our sessions on the Hasidic masters. A very important Hasidic master, but there's no Berdichever Hasidism nowadays. And after the time of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, there was no movement. And the Breslover Hasidim were very small. There were about 200 Hasidim in the time of Rabbi Nachman. So what we're talking about here is a small, weak, poor, mostly poor, group of followers of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who was very different than all the other Hasidic rabbis, who was teaching different things than many of the other Hasidic rabbis, and who emphasized personal, subjective relationship with God, praying in your own words in Yiddish, or now we would say in English, every day to develop your own connection to the divine in your own words. And remember a few other things about Rabbi Nachman. One, he would never give specific advice to people, unlike many other Hasidic masters who would tell you who to marry, which job to take, which house to buy, which community to live in. Rabbi Nachman didn't do that. He said, I want my people to be choosers. I want them to be people of bechira. Bechira is free choice in Hebrew. I want my people to take responsibility for their lives. And most important for our purposes, what happened when Rabbi Nachman died in 1810? Who was the next Rebbe? Who was the successor? Hasidism, usually there's a successor, and if not, the community disappears. Who was the successor? There was no successor to Rabbi Nachman. His student Reb Nassan was the leader of the next generation, but he refused the mantle of Rebbe. And in one gathering, when the Hasidim gave him a strimal, they gave him the fur hats that Rebbes wear, he managed to lose it within a week because he didn't want to be considered the Rebbe. And he was known to declare, I'm not the Rebbe, I'm not the Rebbe. The Rebbe is Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman's not alive, he's still the Rebbe. And that's why the other Hasidim would call the Breslover Hasidim a nickname, the Toiter Hasidim, the dead Hasidim, because they follow a dead Rebbe. Interestingly, the same accusation or kind of insult has been hurled now at Lubavitcher Hasidim who follow the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's no longer alive. But at the time, until recently, this was a unique situation. The Breslovers would respond to that insult by saying, better a dead Rebbe who's alive than a live Rebbe who's really dead. Very strong critique of many of the other Hasidic masters of the time who had power, they had courts, they were living, but they didn't have the sense of aliveness and powerful teaching that the Breslover Hasidim found in Rabbi Nachman's teachings. So this is the background. Now we have to understand before we go on that there was another Hasidic group in the Ukraine, the Savraner Hasidim, Savran, S-A-V-R-A-N. And have you ever heard of the Savraner Hasidim? Most people have not. And yet they were the most powerful Hasidic group in the Ukraine at the time. They numbered about 3,000 or 3,500 followers. They followed Reb Moshe Tzvi of Savran, who had been a student of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. We'll say more about him in a bit. And among his followers were counted very wealthy Hasidim, which is like a contradiction in terms in many stories, but Here there were wealthy Hasidim, and they had deep connections to the government, the Russian government, through various situations and stories. And so that Hasidic community, led by Rabbi Moshe Tzvi of Savran in the 1830s, beginning really in 1834, declared war on the Breslover Hasidim. And Rabbi Moshe Tzvi of Savran issued a public declaration that said, anyone who sells flour to the Breslover Hasidim will be excommunicated. Anyone who does business with them, anyone who marries their daughters or sons to your daughters or sons will be excommunicated. It's a mitzvah to do anything you can do to make their lives as difficult as possible. It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. And he issued this proclamation far and wide. So there are two things we have to understand. What was the reason for all of this? And then more importantly, we're talking about conflict. How did Reb Nosson respond to all of this in a way that was drawing on Jewish teachings, and particularly the teachings of his teacher, Rabbi Nachman, in a way that was nonviolent and yet effective in resolving or transforming this conflict? So first, the causes of this machloket, the causes of this controversy or this conflict, really this uneven asymmetrical conflict, this persecution, this sectarian persecution within Hasidism. So there were revealed reasons and there were hidden reasons for this conflict. The revealed reasons have to do with everything I said earlier about how Breslover Hasidism is different than other Hasidic communities. The emphasis on personal prayer was seen as dangerous by some other Hasidic masters. Because what if you have a big decision to make about your Jewish life and how to practice Judaism, and instead of going to the authorities, the rabbis of your generation, of your town, you go into the forest and you talk to God about it, and you come up with some cockamamie idea about how to express your Jewish life? Chaos could ensue. And we've seen this before in Jewish communities and Jewish life, when people had all kinds of crazy ideas about how to express their Jewish life. So people are very concerned about this. Not only that, but even within this community, there's no master. There's no living Rebbe to keep things in check and make sure that people aren't going off the deep end and figuring out their own ways of living Jewishly and living in general. That's even more dangerous. So you're telling people to go figure things out on their own, or in one famous quote, make God your Rebbe, make God your teacher. And on the other hand, you don't have a master to keep things in check. This is very, very dangerous. Those are some of the revealed reasons for the persecution of the Breslover Hasidim. But about 10 years ago, I think it was, an academic named Tzvi Mark, a wonderful scholar of Hasidism in Israel, found a document and put several different hints together to show that there was a hidden reason as well. There was a hidden reason for this conflict, for the persecution, for Rabbi Moshe Tzvi's intense antipathy toward the Breslover Hasidim. And Tzvi Mark argues, based on strong evidence, that Reb Moshe Tzvi of Savran desperately wanted to marry Rabbi Nachman's daughter. Not because he was in love with her, this isn't a fairy tale or a romance, but because he wanted to be the successor to Rabbi Nachman. He wanted to take the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, the surprising and creative teachings of Rabbi Nachman, and form a more traditional Ukrainian Hasidic community around that. He wanted to establish a court with all the trappings of other Hasidic courts, with a unity of dress and style and liturgy and prayer, and establish a new dynasty so that he would become the Breslover Rebbe after Rabbi Nachman. And the person who opposed this match more than anyone else was Reb Nosson, Rabbi Nachman's student, because Reb Nosson understood what Rabbi Nachman had intended, which was not to become a mainstream Hasidic community limited by its customs and style of dress and style of prayer. Rabbi Nachman was creating a path for anyone in any community, Hasidic, non-Hasidic, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, pre-modern, modern, in any denomination. Anyone can access these teachings. And this is, by the way, why Breslover Hasidism has spread so much, because it really isn't the kind of place where you have to pay a tax for entering this Hasidic path. You don't have to dress a certain way. You don't have to give up your family customs and adopt new customs. In other Hasidic groups, you often do. But here, all you have to do is practice hitbodedut, practice personal prayer. And you can do that in your own words, in your own way, on your own time. You have to cultivate joy. You can do that wherever you live. But Rav Moshe Tzvi of Savran wanted Breslover Hasidism to become like other Hasidic groups. Rav Nassan opposed him, or opposed the wedding, the match. And Rav Moshe Tzvi left very disappointed and created his own Hasidic community, which was large and powerful and well-connected. And this is one of the hidden reasons that Tzvi Mark found for this intense persecution. And when you read the material, the letter of excommunication, the ban that Rav Moshe Tzvi issued, it's filled with a kind of intensity that's hard to understand unless there's some personal thing going on. So let's go back to the text now. And in order to understand how Reb Nassan responded to all of this based on the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, we're going to see some teachings of Rabbi Nachman about conflict. This whole series has been about tales of conflict. And this is one of the most powerful, intense examples of a fairly recent conflict. The response to the conflict is what's so interesting for me and I think for us and for our time. These are some of the things that Rabbi Nachman taught about conflict. First, when a person faces strife, he or she can experience a downfall from a spiritual level. It can affect you spiritually to experience conflict and get involved in a conflict. So you should avoid conflict. You should seek peace. On the other hand, Rabbi Nachman taught elsewhere, conflict can lift a person. For a man is a tree of the field. This is a verse in Deuteronomy. Today is Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish New Year of the trees. Many Hasidic masters relate the New Year of the trees to a sense of renewal for people, because people are compared to trees in this verse. A person is a tree of the field. And a tree that lies in the earth cannot lift itself up except with the arrival of flowing water. Trees need water to lift themselves up, to grow, to thrive and flourish. And guess what? Conflict is called water. Like it says, King David says in Psalms, they surrounded me like water all day. They surrounded me like water all day. He's talking about conflict, his persecutors. So persecution is like water. And on the one hand, it can knock you down from your spiritual level. On the other hand, it can help you to continue to grow. It can nurture you. So we have to ask, what's the difference between those two reactions to conflict? And it seems to have everything to do with how do you respond to conflict? If you get involved, and if you become reactive, if you forget yourself and your values, and you lash out, it can knock you down from your spiritual level. It can interfere with your growth as a person. But if you allow it to nurture you and you see that there's something to learn from this situation, then you're like a tree consuming water from the ground. Let's see the next one, scroll down a little bit. All the great tzaddikim reach their levels but remain there. All the righteous people, Rabbi Nachman says, reached a certain level and that's where they stay. They plateaued. But I become a different person in every moment. And this is something Rabbi Nachman talked about a lot about himself. I'm always growing. I'm never satisfied. If I prayed today like I prayed yesterday, I wouldn't want to live. I always want to grow. And the reason for this, the reason that I was able to grow continuously, is that the tzaddik is called a tree. And every tzaddik faces opposition before he grows in order to grow. The sages said controversy is like water. We just saw that. And just as water is necessary for a tree to grow, conflict is necessary for the tzaddik to grow. Constant growth requires constant opposition. The other righteous people, the other leaders had some conflict, but then things settled down, they were accepted, and it was the worst thing to happen to their careers. Because as soon as they were accepted, they plateaued. They lost the spark, they lost the fire, they stopped growing. But I'm always growing. Why? Because I always have conflict. Because people are always attacking Rabbi Nachman of Breslau. And it's true. He faced a lot of antagonism throughout his life. Next, we have a model of conflict and conflict negotiation or management that is very, very powerful and beautiful. I got a chance to study this with some of the local rabbis in Orange County, which is a big joy. And this text is something that I think about a lot. Rabbi Nachman says, the space between antagonists creates a void in which, the kind of void in which the creation of the universe took place. He's referring here to a mystical idea that when God created the universe, there was really, because we are monotheists, God was everywhere. God was one. So there was no place in which God could create the universe. So the first act of creation, from a Jewish mystical perspective, was for God to pull back and leave a void where God is, so to speak, absent. And this, of course, raises all kinds of theological questions, because how can you say that God is absent from anywhere if God is one? And if God is everything, if we're really monotheists, it's a difficult concept. And the mystics deal with those questions. But the first act of creation was making room, making us a space, a void in which the creation can happen. And Rabbi Nachman says it's the same dynamic with people who disagree with one another. It is only because two people disagree that there can be space. If we all agreed about everything, if those two people agreed and held identical positions, there would be no room for creation, for innovation. And in the space between two people, in the space between two positions, two perspectives, two ideologies, there is tremendous potential for a new world to be created through the act of speech, as God created the world through the act of speech. So when you see disagreement, when you see diversity of opinion, don't run away, don't shut it down, don't think that it's dangerous. It's actually an incredible opportunity for creativity and new ideas to happen. And we can find many examples of this, from the early days of Apple to things that happen in families where you have differences of opinion and perspective that lead to great new ideas about how to manage things. And if you don't have that creative tension, if all you have is uniformity of ideas and uniformity of belief, again, you have the plateau. You have a lack of innovation, a lack of dynamic. Things become very static and there's not a lot of growth. So Ari, we're just going to go to the next text. But these are teachings of Rabbi Nachman that Reb Nosson in the 1830s, 1834, 35, in that period of time, dealing with all of this persecution, Reb Nosson is looking to these teachings to guide him in responding as people from the Savraner Hasidic community are attacking him, attacking his followers, literally throwing stones at them on the street, beating people up, informing on them to the government. People are getting arrested. We'll see more about that. And Reb Nosson is diving into this material to find a way of responding without reacting, without feeding the fire of the conflict. Rabbi Nachman said the whole world is filled with conflict and strife. There are wars between great world powers. And I've mentioned before in other contexts that Rabbi Nachman was really interested in the news of the day. I've shared that he had a follower whose job it was to report on the news, the Napoleonic Wars, and international relations. Rabbi Nachman was very interested in that. He was very worldly in that sense. He would sometimes weave those events into his tales or into his teachings. So there are wars between great powers. There are wars, conflicts between different locales. There are disputes within families, between neighbors, in a household, between husband and wife, parents and children. Even though life is finite and people die every day and death comes closer, we are immortal and our time is precious. People get involved in fights. They forget their true purpose, their true goals in life. And the truth is, Rabbi Nachman says, all strife is identical. The friction within a family parallels the strife between nations. And each person plays the role, plays the part of a world power. And their fights in a family, the disagreement about doing dishes, is somehow parallel and stems from the same root source as the wars between great powers. And you may wish to live in peace, but you're forced into conflict. And then he goes on, we're going to skip to where the dots are, the ellipsis. A man living alone can become insane because within each person are the warring nations. Each one of us has different voices, different powers, different inner positions and perspectives. And the dominant, and listen to this psychological language written in before 1810. The dominant personality of each person, yours, mine, is that of the victorious nation. My presenting personality, my dominant personality, is that of the nation, or the voice, the inner voice that has won the battles, that has won the wars. Each time a new nation is victorious, the person must change completely, because now there's a whole new personality. He's describing a kind of schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, but he's saying this is true of everyone. Everyone has these different aspects. Then there's a thread in psychology that explores this in great depth, that some people call parts work, that accepts the fact that people have different voices inside, and we need to work with all of that and make sense of all of that and make order and make peace internally. But if you're alone, you can go insane. Why? Because when you live with people, the inner battles are expressed toward family or friends. That's what happens. That's why we have conflict. Our inner conflict is projected outward. This is deeply, deeply psychological in modern language. And being in community, which allows us to play out certain conflicts that are inside of us, saves us from containing those conflicts internally and losing our minds, because we keep changing our dominant personality. That's a very striking theory of conflict. But when the Messiah comes, the world will have peace. Now, just two more things, and then we'll pause for questions and discussion. And I have to tell you how this all ended. But we'll see the next three sources together, actually. The first is Rabbi Nachman taught, and this is the most important thing that Reb Nosson got from Rabbi Nachman in this regard. Rabbi Nachman taught in a lesson in Likutei Moharan, lesson 6. One of the first lessons he taught Reb Nosson years earlier, he had taught that the essence of tshuva, of repentance, is when a person experiences humiliation, when a person is embarrassed by other people or a situation, or a realization is embarrassing sometimes, and then the person is silent and still in response to that humiliation and does not react. Notice the double language, silent and still. Meaning, in Hebrew, it's yidom v'yishtok. Meaning a person doesn't react to someone, let's say, making fun of him. Doesn't react by yelling back or trying to come up with a better insult, but just is silent. And still means that the person is silent internally as well. Meaning they're not, Ruvain makes fun of Shimon, and Shimon, instead of responding and reacting, is silent, but inside he's seething with anger. That's not what Rabbi Nachman's talking about here. But if Shimon is both silent and doesn't respond and is calm inside and is centered, sits still inside internally, then that is the essence, that is an incredible opportunity to repent. That's the teaching. And there's a lot more to say about that teaching, but that first line of this teaching, of experiencing humiliation and not being reactive externally or internally, is something that echoed in Reb Nosson's life as he was experiencing this persecution. So we're going to see two things now. One took place with a student of Reb Nosson. And at this time, remember I said there were about 200 Breslover Hasidim? By this time, 1835 or so, there were, according to the record and the manuscript that I have, there were only 5 people in the world who would identify publicly as a Breslover Hasid. 5 people out of 200. Everyone else was afraid because it was so difficult to be part of this community and identified as part of this community because they were experiencing such terrible persecution by other Jews and other Hasidim. There were 5 left. One of them was this Reb Mordechai. And Reb Mordechai was taken by these Savraner Hasidim, and he was beaten and dragged to the center of the marketplace, where he was made to stand on a stone and told to curse Reb Nosson, his teacher, his dear teacher Reb Nosson, the leader of the Breslov community. And despite the blows raining down on him, Reb Mordechai stood on the stone and called out a verse from the book of Esther, from Megillat Esther, and Mordechai would neither bend nor bow. He called that out. And according to the story, the Savraners who were beating him became ashamed when they heard that verse. And they just left him there. And here we have the story that for me is the essential story of this whole saga. In 1835, informers convinced the authorities to arrest Reb Nosson in Uman, where he had traveled for Rosh Hashanah, for the annual New Year pilgrimage. And the police arrived. The Russian police arrived on a Tuesday night. They found Reb Nosson praying at Rabbi Nachman's gravesite, praying to God, probably about what's happening here with this persecution. And he was led away by the police, and people formed a line, a gauntlet of sorts. The Savraner Hasidim and the onlookers were standing along the street where Reb Nosson was being led away, and he was led away with his hands bound. And the Savraner Hasidim and the onlookers were jeering because their enemy finally was being arrested. And there were some Breslover Hasidim there. This is in Uman. So there was a small group of young Breslover Hasidim there. And what did Reb Nosson cry out to them? He cried out to the Breslover Hasidim watching this happen. Lesson 6, Torah Vav, Torah Vav. Remember Torah Vav, lesson 6 we just saw. When someone humiliates you, the essence of repentance happens in that moment if you're able to remain calm and silent and still internally, silent, externally, don't respond, don't throw a stone. And the Breslover Hasidim did not respond. And Reb Nosson said things like, they, our persecutors, are our brothers, and eventually they will be rectified. We ourselves will have to seek remedies for them. They're our enemies. They're persecuting us. They're trying sometimes to do physical violence to us, but they are our brothers, and we have to pray for them. That was Reb Nosson's response. So there's a lot more to say here. There's just to mention that Reb Nosson wrote a letter directly to Rav Moshe Tzvi of Savran. That's at the bottom, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but he just look at the first line of the second paragraph. It is not the custom for an insignificant person to send greetings to the great, but for the sake of peace, I'm writing to you. And he's basically saying, you know, I'm begging you, please. I can't believe what I'm hearing, that you're commanding your followers that it's a mitzvah to persecute us. You know that both you and I spent time by the holy Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Both of us have been involved in Hasidic life. We're trying to grow as people. It can't be. There must be a misunderstanding here. If there's anything I can do to make peace? And his letter went unanswered. So in the end, through a series of events, the persecution melted away in very short order. Several things happened to make that possible. But what's most interesting historically to me in a conversation about conflict and tales of conflict is that we have many situations in Jewish history. We can shut the screen share, Ari. Thank you. We have many situations in Jewish history of conflict and reactivity to conflict. And we saw some of them. But this is a situation where one person, one protagonist in the story, one antagonist refused to play, refused to engage with the conflict. And the conflict was resolved relatively quickly. So there's a fascinating story to me. And when you put it together with the history of civil rights and satyagraha, which is Gandhi's term for the pursuit of truth and nonviolence, there's a lot to learn about a Jewish approach to a spiritual-based, nonviolent approach to conflict. Let's turn to your questions. And how's the connection been, Ari?
The best.
Okay, good.
Got there.
Good.
See, we had like this torment, but it turned out even better.
Ah,
right.
A good Hasidic lesson.
Technology tormented us. What year was this this great conflagration between the Hasidim? About
1833, 34, 35 was the height of it.
And what happened? Like, why? What happened to Rabbi Nosson? He was taken away, and was he released? And what was the charges?
He was released. The charges were trumped up. Something like embezzlement, I think it was. It was something, ridiculous. He was also arrested for having a printing press in his attic, which he did have. He was printing Breslov books and other holy books. That was illegal in that time under the Russian government in the 1830s. And so there were only a few approved printing presses in all of Ukraine, which is why some Breslov books are published in very far away places, Lemberg in Poland, which is now Lvov, or other places in Ukraine. But Reb Nosson had his own private printing press because he was printing Rabbi Nachman's teachings. That was the main charge. They busted him for that. The police came in and wrecked the press, confiscated a lot of books. There are books that he wrote, that Reb Nosson wrote, that were lost at that time that we've never gotten back. That was the main charge. And then there were trumped up charges about money things. And he was released through the intervention of one of his friends who was a follower of Rabbi Nachman, who didn't identify publicly, wasn't even Orthodox, but had connections to the government. And his name was Hirsch Bear Bernhard. He became an academic scholar. He moved to England, and he became a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, in a modern academic critical scholar, and he was a follower of Rabbi Nachman too.
One of the participants says, the story sounds very Christian. Rabbi Nachman's teaching on nonviolence sounds very Christian. My guess would be that actually this tradition is our tradition that was taken on by Christianity in a certain way. But can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great point. Turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek actually appears first in Isaiah, in our tradition. So Christianity publicized it and made it famous in reference to the Roman ruling government, ruling authority, and made it a primary ethos, a religious ethos. But that appears originally in the books of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and in Psalms. Psalms has verses about the captors gambled for my clothing. This appears in Bob Dylan's lyrics too, but he's taking it from Psalms. The idea of a martyred hero, a martyred saint, righteous person who's being persecuted by others with great power appears throughout Psalms and elsewhere in the prophets. And remember that Christianity uses these images, but also Jesus also said, according to one of the books of the New Testament, as it's called by Christians, we call it the Christian Bible. Jesus said, I came not to bring peace, but to bring the sword. So there's a whole conversation here about selective reading and which quotes from famous religious books become famous and well known and repeated a lot, and which ones are kind of ignored. So in Judaism, we don't quote the verses about being persecuted that often, even though we could, and it appears in some of our lamentation literature. After the Crusades, for example, these verses are quoted very often. On Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple and all the suffering of Jewish history, these verses are referenced more, but they don't hold a pride of place in the Jewish imagination, because I think Jews have generally emphasized not victimhood, but life and the choice to celebrate in spite of the pain of Jewish history and to turn that pain into something positive. And in Christianity, the verse about bringing the sword is generally not quoted often either. It was quoted by the Crusaders selectively. It served their purpose, but it's not quoted nowadays as much in typical Christian churches. So that's a whole other conversation. But absolutely, it has roots. These ideas have roots in Judaism.
Dr. Norman Rosen is just shocked and dismayed to hear stories like this and how Jews can turn on Jews and even use the authorities to take revenge. So I don't think it's an answer other than to note that these are stories within our tradition. This particular story, I would venture to guess most people online have never heard, because not that I know all the stories, but it's just a story I've never heard. So it's
late and it was suppressed. It's a later story than most of the chroniclers of the Hasidic movement, but it was also suppressed. And just to respond to Dr. Rosen, it's shocking and dismaying. But I think one of the lessons here is that there's no guarantee of right action just because you're a religious person. And this is one of the messages of the tradition itself. One of the things that the rabbis taught was that the Torah itself is life. It's a tree of life. It's an elixir of life. It gives us life. It gives us meaning. It's beautiful. We love learning Jewish stuff. But the rabbis also said, if you're not careful and you begin to misuse or weaponize what you learn, then the Torah itself can become a poison. The rabbi said this in the Talmud. So there's no guarantee, and we shouldn't become complacent just because we're living a Jewishly connected life that now we're going to be ethical and good people. We can fall into traps in spite of all of that. And here are examples. They're very instructive, disturbing, dismaying examples of people who, in the name of religion, distorted Judaism in order to attack and persecute others. If you interviewed one of the Savraner Hasidim and said, why are you doing this? They probably would have said something about how this small Breslover movement, this community, is an existential threat to Jewish life. They're going off the rails. It's dangerous. It's false messianism or something. They probably had some rationale for this, but at the point when it becomes, as you say, informing to the authorities, getting people arrested, cutting into their livelihood, and even physically attacking other Jews, you've got to understand at some point that you're on the wrong side of this. And the last source we have on that point, Ari, if you can just go back to the text for one more moment, we have a kind of postscript to the story of one of the organizers of the persecution, one of the greatest opponents who caused a lot of harm here, number 11. And Reb Nosson writes later that this person who caused a lot of the trouble by whispering in the ear of the Savraner Rebbe visited Reb Nosson later, a year or two later. And this is the story he tells. Reb Nosson writes, he ascended to my attic room, fell at my feet, began kissing my feet through the shoes. And he asked for forgiveness with tears running down his face. He said, I've sinned. All the slander was through me. I was telling stories about you, Breslover Hasidim. What can I do? Forgive me. And he promised that he would do anything to fix what he had done, and he would work for my benefit with all his might. So that's a postscript of someone who realized, I let this go way too far. I let it go way too far for personal reasons and for distorted religious reasons. We have to be careful. It's one of the lessons of all these tales of conflict, is that religion and religious sources and commitments and that feel absolute and that perhaps are absolute are very dangerous. And they require great care as we handle our theological power and choices and our sacred texts.
The teaching of Rabbi Nachman about conflict and analogizing it to water and the tree is very interesting to me. And it maybe ties back to, I think, our first program where we talked about, on this topic, we talked about how conflict is good in the context of chavruta. So in a way, it's the same thing. It can be good and it can be bad. It can be used to generate deeper learning, more knowledge. And it's good to have in a chavruta people who are different from each other. That creates that friction.
Absolutely.
So it ties in. It was very nice. Let's see. What other questions do we have? There are so many questions, and some are I'll have to share the chat with you so you can answer them maybe as an aside. I'm trying to keep us on this topic. Can you talk about, well, we spent a lot of time with different Rebbes, and maybe at our closing program, I'm going to try something on when we start on Sunday. I'm going to do a breakout room, and you're each going to be asked to say, who is your favorite Rebbe that you've learned about in this 1 month and why? So just, I'm giving, since you're on this and there'll be other people in the room that weren't here today, give that some thought over Shabbat. You've learned about so many different Rebbes. Who is your favorite and why? So we'll get there. Are there, have you been in the presence of holy people like a Rebbe Nachman? And if so, who would that be, and how did you feel them as being holy?
I certainly have, and on a fundamental level, there's at least a potential of holiness in every person. That's what it means that human beings are created in the image of God. And so to some extent, the answer has to do with my ability to perceive that rather than their actual spiritual standing. Because if I really knew how to look at people, I would really feel that I'm in the presence of holy people whenever I'm in the presence of people. Perhaps with the exceptions of those who have, through their actions, renounced the image of God through tremendous evil, and that does happen. But I on a more simple level, I do feel like I've been in the presence of holy people, and it has to do with a sense of presence, humility, modesty, ferocity of commitment to certain values, and with that, a kind of compassion. And a lot of this is difficult to put into words. Some of it is sensory. Some of it is experiences I've had in the presence of people where I've gotten a sense that's very hard to describe in our language of a kind of wave of inspiration at seeing something very simple, like an old Breslover Chassid, who I know to be a very special person, a very humble, very special person, who's known as he's sort of known as a tzaddik today. He's a Breslover Chassid who's known as a tzaddik today, but he doesn't play any role, and he would laugh if you said that. But he sweeps the shul. He gives out cookies to the kids. He's that kind of person, very humble, very giving. And I once saw him walk by me in shul, and he saw that someone's talis, someone's prayer shawl, was hastily placed on a chair with the strings of the tzitzit hanging down onto the floor. And as he walked by, and he was walking quickly, he quickly grabbed up the strings of the tzitzit and put it on top of the chair so it wouldn't be on the floor, because tzitzit are holy objects. You don't want them dragging on the floor. And I just caught a glimpse of that and got a wave of a feeling of something that I can't put into words. It makes it small to talk about it, but I've experienced things like that. And the most powerful thing for me is experiencing people who are really not thinking about themselves so much, but really thinking about how to help other people in a consistent way. Those are the people I really have experienced as holy, who are giving and giving and giving without any resentment and with a great sense of joy and presence. There's a lot of that holiness. And the last thing to say is there are, William James wrote a great classic book called Varieties of Religious Experience. There are varieties of holiness. And that's one of the fundamental lessons of Hasidism, is that there's not just one expression of holiness. Everyone has a different way of expressing holiness. And we need to look out for that and be alert to those moments that express holiness in the world through the prism of each person.
Hildy wants to know if there are still conflicts today between Hasidic communities. And I know for a fact there are conflicts within Hasidic communities, because there's many challenges as to who will take over a dynasty once the Rebbe passes away. And I think the Satmar, for example, are having that challenge. So could you address that question?
There have been conflicts between Hasidic communities well into the 20th century, even the 21st, but several of them are a little more, everything gets old, and sometimes conflicts also get old. So they have less fire than they used to have. So there were conflicts between Satmar and Lubavitch for many years, different positions, ideological positions about the state of Israel and other things. There are several other, famous conflicts, but the more intense ones are the ones that you mentioned. And there was an article I think in Tablet magazine, maybe a month ago. I could be mistaken about the time, because time has been blurring during this pandemic, but I think it wasn't too long ago, about one of those controversies within a Hasidic community about succession. And that gives a very kind of close-up, intimate example of what's happening, between brothers and the widow of the previous Rebbe, and this isn't at all useful, because we should not be gossiping about these kinds of things, but it's instructive to see how the dynamics of power and religious commitment and different styles of leadership come into play here. So that's where people are really struggling with these things. We were talking today about conflict and persecution of the Breslover Hasidim, and it's really not like that anymore. But I'll just mention that I met a Breslover Hasid who's not so old, but he told me that when he was studying in yeshiva in the 50s in Israel, he was kicked out of yeshiva for becoming a Breslover Hasid, for becoming interested in Breslov Hasidism. So even that recently, there were people who were suffering for their interest in this Hasidic movement and these teachings, and it was seen as controversial until well into the 80s, when there was a concerted effort on the part of the Breslov leadership to mainstream Breslov Hasidism in the ultra-Orthodox communities, particularly in Jerusalem.
Rhea Dorn has a statement that she wants you to comment on, which she feels a big part of Jewish spiritual life has been left out. What about the women in the Hasidic world, which you touched upon a bit, but we haven't really got back to? I think you promised to mention something about some great Hasidic women, and you kind of did, but only a little bit.
Yeah, I was saving some of that for Sunday, but I'll say briefly
No, that's
that.
fine. That's fine. You can, Reardon will have to come back on Sunday. But
No,
you can
I'll say briefly that in we've talked about this in the class on Rabbi Nachman, that Rabbi Nachman was very specific and explicit about the women playing a equally central role in Hasidic life as the men, and that's why he made certain decisions that we talked about, like publishing his stories in Hebrew and Yiddish so the women could read it, because most of the women didn't have the education in classical Hebrew language. So you find that in the Hasidic community. You find Reb Nassan writing letters to his students and his son, and he'll talk about the great holiness with great reverence for the women in the Breslov community, Rabbi Nachman's daughters and others who are forces in the Breslov community, and the friendships between them, which is not something you find in many Hasidic contexts, were very beautiful. They were things of grace and deep respect and dignity. There were other women who really played the role of Hasidic rabbis, in part or in full for periods of time. It wasn't the mainstream thing, but there were certainly women who were Hasidim, Hasidot, and still are in every Hasidic community. But in the Breslov community and in Lubavitch, you find that women are very actively engaged as spiritual seekers, not just as homemakers supporting the husband and children to live their spiritual life. And that is the women's spiritual life, which is, I don't want to simplify or caricaturize, but that is sometimes in Hasidic communities the way women talk about their spiritual life. That is the expression of their spirituality. And it's a very, non-modern way of relating to those issues. But in Breslov and Lubavitch, there are women who are traveling to visit the graves of the tzaddikim, like the men do, engaged in their own prayer life and their own creativity, their own religious creativity, and even teaching Torah and teaching Hasidism. Usually women are teaching other women, they're not teaching men. You have a lot of gender divide, but women who are really in leadership positions. And you can find that in the Breslov community. You can find it very easily online. For example, at Breslov Research Institute, some of their great teachers are women. And I only know that because my wife tells me, because they don't want men watching their videos.
We have time just for one or two more quick points. Have you encountered any holy people outside the Jewish community? I know we're very happy to have, I don't know if Irene is still with that. We have Irene Lancaster with us, who's joined us from Manchester for this series and hopefully for more. And she has encountered the Dalai Lama, for example. Can you give us examples of people like that who would fit within this model that you've encountered or just that you've read about?
Yeah, I've encountered many holy people outside of the Jewish community. I would differentiate holiness from holy celebrities. In other words, there are many holy people who are unknown to the world, but when you're in their presence, you recognize that there is something divine going on in the situation between you. When you're in a conversation, the way that they listen and the way that they're present and the way they make life choices to really help other people. So I have a friend who's a student of Professor Wiesel, who's a priest, a woman priest, who works with the homeless in Boston and helps homeless people who are mentally ill using poetry. She has them write poetry and engage with their own thoughts and lives and life stories through poetry. And she's a very holy person. When I've seen her and been in her presence, I'm aware that I'm in the presence of holiness. And holiness takes many different forms. And one of the great things that I love about Judaism is that we never insist that people need to become Jewish to be holy. And there's a great, very small moment with the Baal Shem Tov when the Baal Shem Tov says to his wagon driver, Alexei, who was not Jewish, he said, "Alexei, be careful. I saw the priest of your village pass the church and he didn't cross himself. Be careful." There's an implicit understanding that religiosity or connection to the divine or the vertical is an essential element of human life. And it doesn't have to be Jewish. It's whatever expression it takes. And the Baal Shem Tov would famously pray for every mother's child. So that universalism is something we find in the original forms of Hasidism. And you still find it sometimes. You still definitely find I know a lot of Breslover Hasidim, and this idea that we have a special mission as Jews, but it's on behalf of the entire world, is very real to them. They think globally, and they act very locally. They act in terms of their own shul and their own spiritual practice, but they think about it in terms of how it affects the whole world and all the people of the world.
Well, I want to thank you for this series, Tales of Conflict and Wrestling with Sacred Texts. I think you ended with a great text and a great teaching. All is relevant to us as Jews and as members of the greater world, and there's a lot of conflict within the greater world that we see within our country, but certainly within our Jewish world. We don't all get along, and so we have a lot to think about and a lot of text. And I think this last teaching gives us hope and gives us something to think about in that context. So thank you, Ariel, and hope to see everybody at our closing session on Sunday. That's it. Today was the 18th of 19 programs. Officially, including the rabbis, it's 20 programs total. So Sunday, I believe it's 4 p.m. Pacific time is our final program. If you're not on the list or for the invitation, just email me, Ariekatz, A-R-I-E-K-A-T-Z, number 18 at gmail.com. And I'll send you the invitation. You can join you can learn more about CSP, occsp.net. I didn't say that because I assume most of you, since you're on here, would know about CSP, but if for some reason this is your first program ever, occsp.net, you can get onto our mailing list, and I hope you'll join us. I'll share the chat with you, Ariel. Lots of questions in there.
Great.
And many people saying, awesome program, like Michelle, awesome program. And it is. Ariel, when we had you here for our community, and you came here to talk about your book, which I urge if you have not read it, Witness Lessons from Ariel, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom by Ariel Burger. Ariel came to Orange County about 1.5 years ago, maybe 2 years, to talk about it. And we thought about bringing you for the month. I didn't know exactly what you would do, but now I do, because we've been through 18 programs, and I'm glad you were the perfect teacher for the time right now. Any other subject would be interesting, but tone deaf. This is right in what we all need. So thank you for your teaching today and for your teaching over the month. We'll thank you more on Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. I will share the gallery view. I'm wishing you all a safe day. It's good to see you. If you're on, that means you're hopefully in good health or doing well, have either recovered or have been vaccinated. Keep healthy. In California, things are getting much better. I'm understanding the United States and globally as well. So hopefully by next year's 1 Month Scholar, we could deal with a totally different topic that would be relevant. But this year, this is perfect. Thank you, Ariel. And the phone worked out very well. I think the visuals and the audio were great. Hopefully you can all hear me. I put on this thing because if I use my other microphone, you could hear like every sound in this house. If this is not good, maybe I'll get a different headset. So with that, good to see you. See you guys on Sunday. If you don't know about our adult retreat with Erica Brown, if you've never heard of Erica Brown, know that she's an amazing teacher. We're going to focus on the Scroll of Esther and art. Hopefully you'll join us. You'll register. If you're a patron, please do register as soon as possible. We got to organize some treats to come your way. And with that, I am going to get some other work done. Ariel, I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody. Bye, Ingrid.
Bye, everyone. Stay well.
Keep healthy.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Good Shabbos. Good to see you, Phyllis Gilmore. Nice. Okay, Bonnie Richmond, you're there too. Elizabeth Sandler, I've seen you on a lot of programs. Welcome to CSP. Barry Klatzker, you're looking very Hasidic these days. Get the beard growing a little longer. Michael Rubin, you need to grow a beard. And you can, a bigger one. We've always had that. We got to have a wild Hasidic thing. Howard Dragutsky, please do not grow a beard. Everybody else, I'll see you later. Take care. Bye.